Hello everyone, this is Chase Pounds. Welcome to my channel. Now my subject for today is I know I'm late on the subject, but this was a video dedicated to St. Patrick's Day and of Irish Heritage Month, which I realized recently that March was Irish Heritage Month. My main subject was going to be on being how did Irish Americans become white, considered widely accepted as white Americans in the United States. And I was actually watching a couple of videos on this subject too to get ideas of how to discuss the format. And really how it gets started. How did this all starts is with the it's between the about the Revolutionary War, between the era of the Revolutionary War and prior to the Civil War. There was an influx of Irish immigrants that came to the United States, particularly what comes to mind is between the period of the 1840s and 50s, as Irish immigrants were trying to escape social oppression and turmoil in Ireland. And along with that was what commonly comes to mind is the Great Potato Famine, which was contributing factor to the plight of Irish immigrants leaving and coming to the United States, because the potato was part of the Irish diet at the time, and the Irish were very dependent on potatoes, which by that point was becoming very scarce. And hunger, starvation, and disease was rampant, making conditions unbearable for many Irish. And that's part of the reason they say that many Irish came to the United States. Though people also conflicted with oppression with the British government, the supremacy that was also a driving factor as well as hatred and prejudice for Irish Catholics, particularly. And there was a lot of that here in the United States as well, as most were Protestant, were favored Protestants. And it was when a lot of Irish came to a lot of the Irish that came here were escaping trying to escape the oppression of and the turmoil in Ireland, as people were dying and starving every day from this famine, and people were eating. It was kind of a mad rush. It wasn't just something that people we may think that Irish just were planning in the vans that at some point in time they would come to the United States for their life. Though it was kind of a mad rush to leave Ireland and to get to the United States, as people were dying, just trying to flee out of the communities to reach the ports, get on the ships to leave Ireland. And many people who sailed on these ships died of starvation and disease on board the ships. Some didn't even make it to the United States. Some people died on the way, on the voyage. And in a way, it kind of put me in mind a little bit of the Middle Passage with the slave trade. And many of these ships that the Irish were on board were were formerly at one point slave ships. So they were crammed in tight conditions in compartments, the same compartments that probably housed many of the slaves. And they were cramped in and they many would, because they're in close proximity, some would probably die disease being unsanitary conditions, and with the lack of food for the ships, many would die of starvation and disease, and some would unfortunately have to be thrown off the ships and thrown into the water. Just as with the male passengers, many slaves that didn't make the United States were thrown into shark-infested waters. And very sad to hear those stories. But many Irish many of the fortunate Irish immigrants that did make the United States still face both trying to adjust to a new country, new society, as well as the struggle of trying to find a decent place of living.
Smart founders know something most people miss. Get your domain name even if you're not ready to launch your business. With Wix, you can grab yours now and then get to
hatred and prejudice was very rampant among the first arriving Irish immigrants. Even among the already established Irish people that had already whose generations have already lived in the United States going back to the Revolution, and now try to distinguish themselves as Scotch Irish from the newly arriving, Southern Irish people that are coming to the United States, sometimes known as Shanty Irish. And many of them were Catholic faith. Many of these Irish were met with discrimination where there were signs that said no Irish need to apply, keeping them from seeking employment, job opportunities. And there was often a stereotype trope that became prevalent during this period, known as Paddy. It was like a racial stereotypical trope, just like for black people, Coon and Sambo. Uncle Tom was a racial trope. Paddy was one of that, where Paddy was considered a drunk, a rebel rouser, kind of feisty type person, always drunk, always picking a fight, that sort of thing. And that became associated in general with Irish, along with poverty. Another even similar racial depictions of Irish were as monkeys or baboons in art pictures. Sometimes they're referred to as the white Negroes in some cases. Interestingly, one thing I frequently heard is that the Irish immigrants that arrived in the United States was deemed as very inferior. They weren't at the status of white people compared to already full-blood Anglo-Saxon Americans that have been in the United States since the Revolution, since America's early settlers came. And they were considered even less valuable, even as slaves, which is kind of interesting to think. A lot of times, in this particular case in New Orleans, many of the slaves, many of the Irish immigrants actually settled more in New Orleans more than in New York. Many people came through New Orleans, then moved away to New York at some point in time. But many of them, not some of them, came to New Orleans and made New Orleans their home, and some had jobs like in the like in the cotton trade. I think as on the ship docks, as well as working the swamps, digging ditches. Sometimes they were, instead of taking the risk of using slaves, they would risk Irish people to work in the swampy conditions, which is very dangerous and very grueling work. Some of them would even risk their slaves doing this type of work. A lot of them would risk Irish people dying instead of slaves, which is interesting because really contrary to popular belief that it really wasn't so much the goal of killing the slaves off, even though some whites would have probably even though whites would think of killing, some whites would felt like killing the slave, but usually killing a slave was more of like a last resort if they were considered out of control or like a really dangerous threat, like if they were conspiring to start rebelling, like the case of Nat Turner. That was considered justifiable to kill a slave, though but for just casually killing a slave was considered a big deal. It was considered loss of income and property. That's why it was such a big deal if a slave escaped too, that they be brought returned because it was very valuable property. So slaves were very valuable, very expensive compared to just an Irish immigrant. They could just find another Irish immigrant as that one replace the other Irish immigrant as the other one had died during the growing working the ditches. So it's very kind of complex caste system how Irish, who we may think of as white, were considered less inferior as a slave, which we would think black people were more at the bottom of the barrel, which they still were, but it was very complex based on the circumstances and status. Status was very complex, kind of contradicting caste system. And many it's interesting too that many Irish themselves were just as would adopt the same prejudices of racism towards Black Americans. Many of them too would also become planters, the slave owners in the South, making the South their home. And this kind of, and a lot of them, as a lot of the Irish too, when they first arrived, sometimes they would stone many of the blacks working on the harbor, on the ship ports. They would stone many of the black slaves just because they were so desperate to get their job. They would try to stone and kill many of the blacks, beat up. They would form gangs to beat up blacks so they could take over their jobs. So it's kind of like a competition between blacks and Irish people, black slaves and Irish people at the time. A lot of them, as I said, Irish became slave owners too. That at the same time, many of the Irish people were against people over in Ireland, still living in Ireland, but were kind of like anti-slavery. There were abolitionists who believed in the views of the abolitionist people who were against slavery, but yet many Irish that came to the United States would eventually, who were trying to assemble with American society, they too interestingly became pro-slavery, and people who were for slavery on the Democratic side, while Republicans, known as the radical Republicans at the time, were against slavery. So it's kind of, again, complex about the whole racial caste system. Many and this is depicted in a lot of pop culture and film too, that many Irish were pro-slavery and were slave owners, particularly in Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind, they were Scarlett O'Hara is a descendant of Irish people. As the O'Haras, they were from, her father came from Ireland and settled to start a plantation known as Tara. And in the miniseries in the kind of like a sequel to Gone with the Wind, Scarlett, which was a book that became a movie, explored a little bit more of Scarlett's Irish heritage, trying to rekindle her roots in Ireland. I guess I'm trying to reestablish and finding more of her Irish heritage or roots. Roots is explored in both the book and the made for TV series. In the miniseries too, Queen with Halle Berry, the white plantation owners, or I think were Irish descent, and the interracial relationship between the slave and the slave owner was Irish, making Halle, the character in Queen, have mixed Irish heritage, which she kind of embraces when trying to pass for white in the story in this miniseries. It's mainly during the Civil War. It was kind of like some of a turning point when the Irish were kind of starting to become a little bit more accepted, after many of both Irish fought on both the Confederate and the Union side of the Civil War. And this will become a thing later on, as many Irish will continue fighting in future wars, or gain kind of respectability and kind of patriotism for the U.S. Even during the Revolution, you had some Irish that fought during the Revolution, early son of American patriotism. And but it was after the Civil War that many Irish started kind of start moving up a little bit, start having from the working class to at some point kind of gain their way into more like service jobs, like central service jobs, as police officers, firefighters. It's actually where the term paddywagon came about, was because as I mentioned, the word paddy was a trope associated with Irish. A lot of times the Irish people were the ones who were always criminals, being locked up and put in the paddy wagon. But then at the same time, over time, Irish people will eventually become the police officers who were doing the arresting and locking up. So the tables were starting to turn a little bit. And then also too, over time, many Irish Americans would also serve at Ellis, would serve would have jobs as what's the word I'm looking for, as immigration I should say they would work at the depot at Ellis Island, inspecting and checking in many of the newly arriving immigrants that would come to Ellis Island, which to them they became a model for the new arriving immigrants that would come, which were the Italians, the Jewish, the Polish, who would also later assimilate with American society and would be accepted as white Americans. At the same time, many Irish too again adopt not to mention too, many Irish will also will work on the railroads too. Well, actually, better way of saying it, many Irish too, many Asian Americans will also come into the between the post-Civil War years. Many Asian Americans immigrated to the United States from the West Coast, working on the railroads, along with Irish. Many Irish too were working on the railroads, and many of them died on the ties that were built, the tracks, the lines, the Continental Railroad. But yet, many Irish would also come up with prejudice, anti-immigration laws, and the Chinese Exclusion Act. The very ones that created the Chinese Exclusion Act, again, they dealt with prejudice and exclusion, prejudice and hatred when they came in. But yet, as they eventually assimilated American society, they adopted the same prejudice laws on other ethnic immigrants, racial immigrants. Over time, Irish would eventually become more assimilated as white Americans, particularly at the post-war years, as many of them would move out of the ethnic neighborhoods, which at one point they lived in slums when they first arrived, then lived in ethnic Irish neighborhoods, and then eventually, at the post-war years, they would move out of the neighborhoods and some would settle into like suburban settings. It was kind of like the new as Black Americans were coming into this for the Great Migration, were moving into the inner city, urban cities. Many of ethnic immigrants left those urban neighborhoods and then started to move into the suburban settings. Many of them started to assimilate with the fabric of American society. And this is the point where they started to distinguish themselves between Irish and assimilated as white Americans, just the same as with other ethnic immigrants, as the Jews, the Polish, the Italians. They didn't really see themselves as Irish. They just were considered just American. At that point, they didn't identify much more with their Irish roots, and many of them would marry, kind of date with living in suburban neighborhoods that weren't Irish, but with other different multi-ethnic white neighborhoods, such as with Italians, Jews, or straight Anglo-Saxon people, and they would sometimes intermarry or interdate or intermarry with different ethnic groups outside of Irish, as prior to this, in their own neighborhood, they would date people of their own Irish race. So that changed too, and that's how I think that was the turning point. Along with that was when President John F. Kennedy, the first Irish Catholic to run for the presidency, that too gave the Irish more sense of hope of the American dream, that there could be anything that could be even as president. And the thing with Kennedy was he kind of dropped away many of the Irish traits and characteristics, and became kind of a full all-American type icon in American history. So that was really, I think, turning point how Irish became accepted as white Americans to where we are now. And it's interesting too. I was watching a documentary. I know this may be a little off topic, but I was watching a documentary with Henry Jr. Gates on the Black Alliance and Jew. Jew was an alliance, interwoven struggle on. And then interesting, they mentioned that there was like a time when the Jewish and African Americans kind of were, as I said, were in alliance together with fighting issues of discrimination and racism in the United States. But this kind of changed between the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, as blacks became a little bit more militant and believed in the struggle, believed in Black Panther and Black Power movement. Changed, kind of created a little friction. Blacks saw how Jewish Americans were living. Many of them who came from who arrived from the Holocaust, were assimilating with American society, were now living were assimilating with white American society, living in the suburban ethnic neighborhoods, prosperous ethnic suburban neighborhoods, while blacks lived in inner city poverty, and this became like a divide of Jewish weren't really like creating like a gap between poverty and wealth. Jewish people often associate with wealth, and that's kind of another like a trope, like a anti-Semitic trope that Jews are always thriving, always rich, always control money, kind of like money, like always. I don't know how to right with the say. It's like money. I guess money. I just can't find the right words for it. Conscientious with money and very controlling with money, and there's the same idea. It says that Jews are always best people. They're always successful, always thriving. They could be in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and they could set a business and thrive. That sort of thing. Like one of those Jewish myths and tropes. And this became a friction with black people, that they saw Jews as always thriving, always successful. To them, they weren't considered Jewish. They were more like considered white to black people. You look at Jewish as being like sort of ethnic, like a certain type of white people, even though they were kind of like a marginalized group of people as well. And you saw how the blacks is being anti-Semitic, That's anti-Semitic, having views, prejudiced views, but I think that's where the friction and turmoil began from that point on, after the Civil Rights Movement, the present, even today with the issue of the Palestinians, the Iran crisis, and so forth. But I think, in my opinion, both sides seem to be wrong, because I think the Jewish were wrong for assimilating with white American society, which was built on the same kind of similar ideas of white supremacy and fascism. But I think black people stooping down to the level of racial ideology or supremacy, because we put up the same type of racism and treatment among white people. So we kind of turn back and doing it to the racism on other white people, kind of being cultured by the society that's oppressing us. This, you can say it may not make sense, but it's just an interesting thing, that this whole subject. And that's all I had to say regarding the subject. It was meant, my subject that was meant for St. Patrick's Day. I'm on behind in certain subjects I want to talk about. That's all I've got to say on the subject. This is Nephew by Chase Pound. Stay tuned for the next video.